On a hot September afternoon in 1356, the fate of France narrowed to a muddy field near Poitiers. Armies collided, banners fell, and by dusk, the unthinkable had happened. The King of France was a prisoner. John II, called John the Good by chroniclers who admired his personal courage, had ridden into battle with the reckless honor of a knight and lost everything that made him a king. His capture was not merely a military defeat. It was the opening of a financial wound so deep that it would drain the kingdom for a generation. John's fall came during the darkest stretch of the 100 Years' War. France had already been humiliated at Crécy. Its countryside was scarred by raids. Its treasury was thin. Yet John believed chivalry still mattered, that a king who fought bravely could steady a fractured realm. At Poitiers, he fought with desperate valor, swinging his mace until surrounded. When the dust settled, he surrendered to the English. A medieval world that treated kings as living symbols now faced a brutal arithmetic. What was a king worth? The answer, the English decided, was everything. From the moment John was taken, negotiations began to turn flesh into coin. Ransoms were common in medieval war, but this was unprecedented. The English crown understood leverage. They held not just a noble, but the sovereign himself. If France wanted its king back, it would pay a price designed to cripple its ability to fight again. The figure that emerged, eventually fixed in the Treaty of Bretigny, was staggering: 3 million écus, a sum that dwarfed annual royal revenues. To guarantee payment, France would also hand over vast territories and hostages, including John's own sons. While diplomats argued numbers, John lived as an honored captive in England. He dined well, hunted, and moved between residences, treated less like a criminal than a valuable asset. Yet the comfort was a gilded cage. Every meal, every courtesy, reminded him that his freedom was measured in gold he did not possess. The moral code of chivalry pressed on him. A king's word, once given, was sacred. If France promised payment, John would be bound to its fulfillment, even at the cost of his own liberty. Back home, the burden fell on a society already close to breaking. To raise the ransom, the French crown squeezed wherever it could. New taxes were imposed, old ones were raised. The dial expanded beyond precedent. Coinage was debased, breeding inflation and mistrust. Merchants grumbled, peasants despaired. In Paris, political tension erupted into open revolt as estates demanded accountability for a war they had not chosen and a ransom they could not afford. The monarchy's authority, never absolute, began to crack under the weight of its own king. Payment came in convoys, chests of silver and gold hauled across borders under guard. Each installment was a national humiliation, a visible reminder that France's sovereignty had been mortgaged. Worse still, the ransom payments drained resources needed for defense. Fortifications crumbled, soldiers went unpaid. Bandits flourished in the vacuum, roaming the countryside as routiers. Mercenaries turned predators. The ransom did not buy peace, it bought paralysis. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny formalized the bargain. John was released, but only after France surrendered territories and agreed to the colossal sum. Hostages were exchanged as living collateral. Among them was John's son, the Duke of Anjou. The message was clear: default would not be forgiven. And then, the unthinkable happened again. The payments faltered. The treasury could not keep pace. One by one, obligations slipped. When the Duke of Anjou escaped captivity, the moral universe of chivalry tilted. John faced a choice that seems almost alien to modern eyes. He could remain free, pleading necessity and poverty, or he could return to England voluntarily, honoring the letter of his pledge. John chose captivity. In 1364, he crossed the Channel back to London, not as a prisoner taken in battle, but as a king surrendering himself to debt. Chroniclers were stunned. Some praised his honor. Others whispered that honor was a luxury France could not afford. The gesture won admiration abroad, but it did nothing to refill the coffers at home. Within months, John fell ill and died in England, a king who had paid for defeat with his life and left his kingdom still bleeding. The long-term cost of John's ransom cannot be measured in coin alone. It reshaped French governance, forcing the crown to experiment with broader taxation and deeper engagement with representative bodies, changes that would echo for centuries. It hardened attitudes toward war, teaching a bitter lesson about the price of chivalric bravado in an age of professional armies. And it left a psychological scar, the memory of a king priced, parceled, and paid for like cargo. Yet history is rarely tidy. John's sacrifice also bought time. His son, Charles V, the future wise king, learned from the catastrophe. He reformed finances, avoided pitched battles, and slowly reclaimed territory through strategy rather than spectacle. In that sense, the ransom that bled France dry also irrigated the soil from which recovery would grow. Still, when the story is told in full, it remains one of the most brutal invoices ever presented to a nation. A king captured in mud, a kingdom taxed to the bone, gold shipped abroad while fields lay empty. The ransom of King John II stands as a stark reminder that in medieval Europe, defeat was not just lost battles. It was years of hunger, unrest, and quiet suffering, paid installment by installment, until the very idea of honor had to be redefined. And when France finally stood again, it did so knowing exactly how expensive a king could be. Now, let the centuries dissolve. Close your eyes. Let the darkness of your room become the dimming light of a medieval evening. Imagine the air growing heavy, not with rain, but with the copper scent of blood and the sour, crushed smell of trampled vineyard grapes. You are no longer where you were. You are in the chaotic twilight of September 19th, 1356. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves amidst the dying roars of a battlefield that has gone terribly wrong. The ground here at Maupertuis, just outside the city of Poitiers, is a mess of churned mud and fallen steel. The heat is oppressive, a lingering summer heaviness that makes the armor of the fallen knights feel like ovens left on too long, which, considering the outcome, is a rather grim culinary metaphor for the roasting the French nobility have just received. Historians still argue whether King John was truly a good king, Jean le Bon, or if the nickname merely meant he was a good fellow, the kind of man you'd want at a feast, but perhaps not at the helm of a sinking ship. But here in the mud, the debate feels distant. What is real is the exhaustion. The French cavalry, the pride of Christendom, has been undone by English longbows and their own hubris. King John, refusing to flee, fights on foot. He is a tall man, imposing in his gilded plate armor, swinging a battle axe with a rhythm born of desperation. He is not alone, though his great army has shattered. Beside him stands his youngest son, Philip, a boy of only 14. Listen closely, and you might hear the boy's voice cutting through the clang of swords, a terrified but steadfast mantra. Père, gardez-vous à droite. Père, gardez-vous à gauche. Father, guard to the right, guard to the left. The king is surrounded. The English and Gascon soldiers are closing in, a surging tide of shouting men who realize that the figure in the golden surcoat is not just an enemy, but a lottery ticket. To kill him would be a tragedy for their bank accounts. To capture him is to win a fortune. The crush is immense. Men are grabbing at his belt, his arms, screaming in a mix of French and English, "Yield! Yield!" It is a moment of profound indignity, the sacred body of the monarch becoming a prize in a violent scrum. Finally, a French exile fighting for the English, a knight named Denis de Maubec, manages to push through the greedy mob. He offers his gauntlet. The king, breathless, sweat stinging his eyes, looking at the ruin of his army, pulls off his own glove. The clasp is made. The king is taken, as the sun finally dips below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The noise of battle fades into the moans of the wounded. But for John, the immediate danger shifts to a strange, surreal courtesy. He is led not to a dungeon, but to the red pavilion of the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock. That very evening, amidst the carnage, the victor serves the vanquished dinner. Imagine the scene. The English prince waiting on the French king at the table, refusing to sit out of respect, pouring wine with hands that were holding a sword hours ago. It is the height of chivalry, a beautiful, polite theater masking the terrifying reality that the King of France is no longer his own man. He is a hostage. And as the stars come out over the corpse-strewn fields of Poitiers, a silence falls that is heavier than the battle itself. It is the silence of a kingdom that has just lost its head, and the long, cold realization that the bill for this dinner will be higher than anyone can imagine. The news traveled north, not like a bird, which flies straight and true, but like a plague, invisible, fast, and chilling the blood of everyone it touched. Bad news in the Middle Ages had a peculiar velocity, seemingly outpacing the fastest horses, carried on the wind and the terrified whispers of refugees. It rolled up from the warm south, past the vineyards that would go unharvested, through the quiet villages of the Loire, and finally, inevitably, it struck the gates of Paris. Imagine standing on the ramparts of the medieval city, looking south. The sky is grey, the heavy, wet wool of an approaching autumn blanketing the rooftops. The bells of Notre Dame begin to toll, not the rhythmic call to prayer that marks the gentle passing of hours, but a chaotic, clanging alarm that rattles the teeth. The message is simple and devastating. The army is broken. The king is taken. For the people of Paris, this was a horror beyond comprehension. A king was not just a political leader. He was the divinely anointed father of the realm, the keystone in the arch of society. Without him, the structure could not hold. Panic is a scent, sharp and acrid, and it filled the narrow, twisting streets of the capital. Shopkeepers boarded up their stalls, burying their silver in the dirt floors of their cellars. Wealthy burghers eyed the city gates, wondering if it was time to flee to their country estates, while the poor looked at the empty granaries and wondered if they would survive the winter. But the heaviest burden of this catastrophe did not fall on the shopkeeper or the peasant. It fell onto the narrow, stooped shoulders of an 18-year-old boy. Charles, the Dauphin, the title given to the heir of the French throne, was everything his father was not. Where King John was robust, loud, and obsessed with the physical glory of combat, Charles was frail, quiet, and intellectual. He was a willow trying to stand where an oak had just been uprooted. He sat now in the Palais de la Cité, the fortress palace on the island in the Seine, staring at maps that suddenly looked like autopsies of his kingdom. The river outside flowed dark and cold, indifferent to the fact that the young man watching it was now the regent of a country that was effectively bankrupt and leaderless. There is a scholarly debate that still simmers quietly among historians regarding Charles's conduct at Poitiers. He had been there, commanding a battalion, but he had left the field before the final disastrous collapse. Was it an act of cowardice, a young prince fleeing the terror of the arrow storm? Or was it, as his defenders argue, the final order of his father, a desperate command to save the heir so the dynasty would not die in a single afternoon? The truth is lost to the mud of history, but the perception in Paris was dangerous. People whispered. They looked at the boy who had returned without his father and saw a runner, not a ruler. Charles had to govern a city that despised him, with a treasury that was not just empty, but echoing. The French crown had been living on credit and devalued coin for years. Now the creditors, the mercenaries, the suppliers, the very knights who had been captured and needed their own ransoms, were coming to collect. It is often said that the only thing more expensive than a war is losing one, and France was learning this lesson one gold écu at a time. To make matters worse, the governing council, the Estates General, sensed blood in the water. This was an assembly of the three orders of society: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, mostly wealthy merchants. Usually, they were a rubber stamp for royal tax requests, crumbling but paying. Now, however, the stamp was hitting back. They gathered in the great hall, a cavernous space smelling of damp stone and unwashed bodies, and the mood was mutinous. They looked at the pale, sickly Dauphin and saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules of France. They didn't just want to talk about the ransom. They wanted to talk about where all the money had gone in the first place. It is a timeless truth of politics that no one hates a tax collector more than a man who has just realized his taxes bought a defeat. The leader of this merchant faction was Etienne Marcel, a man with the charisma of a revolutionary and the ruthless accounting skills of a provost. He stood before the Dauphin, not with head bowed, but with chin high, demanding that corrupt royal advisers be fired and that the estates be given power to oversee the spending of every coin. It was a constitutional crisis wrapped in a hostage situation. Charles listened, his face a mask. He had no army to threaten them with. He had no gold to bribe them with. He had only the fragile legitimacy of his bloodline and a sharp, calculating mind that was just beginning to wake up. He stalled. He nodded. He played for time, which was the only currency he had left. Outside the palace walls, the city was growing darker. The sun set early now, and the nights were long and cold. Rumors flew that the English were marching on Paris, that the Black Prince would soon be dining in the Louvre. In reality, the English army was too small and too laden with loot to besiege the capital. But fear does not consult maps. The Parisians saw English ghosts in every shadow. They reinforced the walls, dragging stones and timber through the mud, working by torchlight. The sound of hammers and saws drifted over the Seine, a nervous heartbeat for a city that felt it was sleeping with one eye open. Meanwhile, messengers were dispatched to the provinces, riding horses into the ground to tell local lords to hold their castles, to gather grain, to prepare for the worst. But the authority of the crown was fraying. In the distant corners of France, local barons looked at the seal of the Dauphin and shrugged. Why listen to a boy who couldn't even keep his father safe? The wolves, both literal and metaphorical, began to test the fences. It was a time of profound loneliness for the young regent. Imagine him walking the drafty corridors of the palace at night, the torches flickering in the drafts, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like the ghosts of his ancestors judging him. He was arguably the loneliest man in Europe, trapped between the English hammer and the Parisian anvil. He likely knew that his father was being treated with pomp and ceremony in the English camp, drinking fine wine and discussing hawking, while he, the son, was left to clean up the spilled blood and broken crockery of the kingdom. It is a bitter irony that the prisoner lived like a king, while the king's replacement lived like a prisoner of his own capital. Yet, in this crucible of stress and fear, something was forging. The iron of Charles's character was being heated. He was learning the art of patience, the weapon of silence. He realized that while his father fought with a mace, he would have to fight with paper, with delay, with the subtle shifting of alliances. The kingdom was beheaded, yes, but the body was still thrashing, refusing to die. And as the winds stripped the last leaves from the trees along the river, signaling the coming of a winter that would freeze the very marrow of France, the Dauphin sat at his desk, dipped his quill in ink, and began to write the first of 1,000 letters that would try to stitch his world back together. The ink was black, but the history it would write was entirely red. While Paris shivered under the grey shroud of panic, and the Dauphin paced his drafty halls, a very different kind of winter was settling over the city of Bordeaux. Here, hundreds of miles to the south, the air smelled of salt, pine resin, and the deep, tannic aroma of oak barrels. Bordeaux was the jewel of English Aquitaine, a city that looked not toward Paris for its orders, but toward the Atlantic and the wine trade that bound it to London. It was here that the Black Prince brought his royal prize, parading King John II through the gates, not in chains, but in a procession that looked confusingly like a triumph for both men. The crowds that lined the cobbled streets cheered, though it was hard to tell if they were cheering for the victory of their English overlord, or simply for the spectacle of seeing the King of France in the flesh. John rode a magnificent black courser, a horse of immense power and beauty, while the Black Prince, in a gesture of calculated humility that must have stung as much as it honored, rode a smaller white hobby horse beside him. It was a piece of political theatre perfect for the Middle Ages. The captor making himself small, so the captive's fall would seem all the more tragic, and therefore all the more expensive. The party settled into the Abbey of St. Andrew, which was hastily converted into a royal residence suitable for a king who was technically a prisoner of war. Winter in the medieval Southwest was not the biting, frozen hell of the North, but a season of relentless, drumming rain and damp chills that seeped into the bones. The days grew short, limiting the hours for hawking and hunting, forcing the court indoors. And what a strange court it was. The English nobility and the captured French lords existed in a bizarre bubble of suspension. Outside the walls, the war had paused, holding its breath. Inside, the wine flowed with a liberality that suggested everyone was trying to forget how they had arrived there. John, true to his nature, did not spend his days weeping or fasting in repentance for the disaster at Poitiers. Instead, he set about living as a king should, regardless of the geography. He organized feasts. He commissioned an astrologer to read the stars, perhaps hoping to find a constellation that looked like a refund. He bought expensive fabrics, furs, and spices from local merchants, racking up debts that were dutifully recorded by English clerks with raised eyebrows. There is a fascinating historical truth buried in the ledgers of this winter. King John was allowed to maintain a full household. He had his own chaplain, his own cooks, his own barber, and even a king of minstrels to ensure the music was up to royal standards. To a modern observer, this looks like madness. Why pamper the enemy? But to the medieval mind, John was not a criminal. He was a fellow knight who had lost a gamble. To mistreat him would be to insult the very system that gave the English aristocracy their own power. If a king could be thrown in a dungeon, then what was safe? So they kept him warm, fed him peacocks and lampreys, and waited. But the waiting was fraught with tension. The English were terrified of a rescue attempt. Rumors swirled that loyal French knights were gathering in the countryside, plotting a daring raid to snatch their monarch back before he could be shipped across the sea. The Black Prince, for all his courtesy, doubled the guards. Every shadow in the cloisters of St. Andrew was scrutinized. The prince knew that while John was a guest at dinner, he was a winning lottery ticket at the bank, and you do not leave a winning ticket on the table near an open window. Amidst the feasting, the grim work of diplomacy began. Papal legates, cardinals sent by the Pope in Avignon, descended on Bordeaux like a flock of very bright, very noisy red birds. They were desperate to broker a peace before the conflict spiraled further. The church hated the war. It drained money that could be going to Rome or Avignon, and distracted Christendom from the threat of the Ottomans in the east. The cardinals flitted between the English and French quarters, their robes rustling, carrying proposals and counter-proposals. They managed to secure a truce, a temporary cessation of hostilities that would last until 1359. It was a diplomatic band-aid on a severed limb, but it was enough to ensure that John would not be rescued by force. The truce essentially sealed his fate as a traveler. He would be going to England. Historians often debate the mindset of King John during this strange suspended winter. Was he truly as oblivious as his spending habits suggest? A man so wrapped in the delusion of his own majesty that he couldn't see the bars of his cage? Or was his behavior a form of defiance? There is a school of thought suggesting that John's refusal to act like a prisoner was a psychological weapon, a way of saying, "You may have my body, but you cannot compel my spirit to be small." By continuing to spend and feast, he forced the English to treat him as a sovereign equal, preventing them from reducing him to a mere hostage. It was a dangerous game of chicken played with etiquette instead of cars. If he acted the king, they had to treat him as one. If he acted the defeat, they might have locked him away and forgotten him. As the weeks dragged on, the weather turned treacherous. The Bay of Biscay is notorious for its winter storms, and the Black Prince was in no hurry to risk his prize to the bottom of the sea. so they waited for the spring thaw. The atmosphere in Bordeaux grew stale. The jokes at the banquet tables were retold once too often. The French lords, missing their families and fearing for their estates back home, grew sullen. Even the wine, of which there was a truly heroic amount consumed, enough to float a small cog, began to taste of vinegar and regret. The good fellow, King John, maintained his cheer, but even he must have looked out the leaded windows at the rain sliding down the glass and felt the crushing weight of time. He was 47 years old, past the prime of medieval life. He was wasting months in a comfortable purgatory while his son struggled in Paris and his kingdom bled. Finally, the season turned. The grey skies of Aquitaine began to fracture, revealing glimpses of a pale, hopeful blue. The winds shifted, no longer driving rain against the stone, but carrying the scent of open water and travel. The orders came down to pack the chests. The tapestries were rolled up, the plate silver packed in straw. The Black Prince was taking his trophy home. The departure from Bordeaux was solemn. The citizens watched in silence as the king was led to the docks. He boarded a ship not as a commander, but as cargo, precious, insured, and heavily guarded. As the lines were cast off and the cog drifted away from the quay, the shoreline of France began to recede. John stood on the deck, watching the coast of his realm shrink until it was nothing but a thin line of green and brown against the horizon. He would not see it again for years. The safety of the land was gone, replaced by the indifferent heave of the Atlantic. He was sailing towards the lion's den, leaving behind a winter of limbo for a spring of negotiation that would prove far colder than any frost in Bordeaux. The English Channel has never cared for the titles of men, to the grey, undulating waves that separate the continent from the island. A king is no heavier than a cask of wine, and a crown offers no ballast against the heave of the tide. For 11 days, King John II surrendered his sovereignty to the rhythm of the sea. The flagship that carried him, a vessel of high wooden castles and snapping canvas, creaked and groaned like a living thing, a wooden whale swallowing a monarch to spit him out on a foreign shore. This voyage marked a profound psychological transition. On land, John could pretend to be a guest. At sea, surrounded by English sailors who spoke a dialect that sounded like stones grinding together, he was undeniably cargo. The air was thick with salt spray that crusted on velvet robes and stung eyes accustomed to the soft light of palaces. It was a suspension of reality, a time when the King of France was neither ruling nor fighting, but simply enduring the pitch and roll of a world that offered him no footing. When the lookout finally cried out, pointing to the chalky smudge of the English coast, it was not a moment of relief, but of grim arrival. They landed at Plymouth in early May 1357, stepping onto a dock slick with spring rain. If John expected a dungeon, he was immediately disappointed, or perhaps relieved to find a pageant. The journey from Plymouth to London took weeks, a slow rolling spectacle designed to show the English people exactly what their taxes had bought. It was a travelling circus of high diplomacy. The procession wound through the green waking countryside of southern England, past hawthorn hedges bursting with white blossoms, and villages where peasants leaned on their scythes, mouths agape, to watch the French king ride by. The English treated him with a confusing mixture of reverence and curiosity. He was the enemy, the man whose soldiers had burned their coastal towns. Yet here he was, riding tall, hunting with their own lords, and dining on their best venison. It is one of the strange paradoxes of the medieval mind that a captured king was an object of celebrity rather than hatred. The villagers didn't throw rotten vegetables. They threw flowers. They cheered. It was as if they were applauding the actor who played the villain in a play they all loved. For John, this must have been a surreal nightmare masked as a holiday. He was smiling, waving, and nodding, performing the role of the good fellow, while every mile brought him closer to the cage of the capital. Finally, on the 24th of May, the procession reached London. If Plymouth was a village and Bordeaux a provincial capital, London was a monster. It was a sprawling, chaotic, smelly, vibrant beast of a city, bursting at its wooden seams. The population had turned out in numbers that defied counting. Chroniclers claim that the crush was so dense it took hours for the royal party to cross London Bridge. Imagine the sensory overload. The bridge itself was a tunnel of shops and houses, crowded with people hanging from windows, clinging to signposts, and sitting on rooftops. The air roared with the sound of thousands of voices, the ringing of every church bell in the city, and the blare of trumpets. Tapestries and rugs were hung from the balconies, turning the narrow streets into corridors of color. Reds, blues, and golds fluttering in the breeze off the Thames. The wealthy guilds of London, the goldsmiths and fishmongers, had set up elaborate displays. In the Cheapside district, fountains were rigged to run with wine instead of water, a detail that surely helped the mood of the mob, though one wonders about the sticky aftermath on the cobblestones. At the center of this hurricane of noise rode the two protagonists, reprising the visual metaphor they had practiced in Bordeaux, but now on the grandest stage in Europe. King John was mounted on a massive white courser. Some sources say black, but let us imagine the white, a symbol of purity and sovereignty, while the Black Prince rode beside him on a small black pony. The contrast was deliberate and theatrical. The captor made himself small to emphasize the greatness of his prize. It was a subtle psychological flex. Look how powerful we are, the English seem to say, that we can catch a man this big with a prince this humble. Historians have long debated the reaction of the Londoners to this specific image. Did they see the chivalric respect the prince intended, or did they see a carnival? There is a wry humor to be found in the accounts of the day, the English citizens cheering wildly for a French king who was ostensibly the reason their taxes were so high, while the Black Prince, their hero, bobbed along on a pony like a squire. It suggests that for the common person, the war was less about national hatred and more about the irresistible pull of a good show. The procession wound its way to the Palace of Westminster, where the final act of this strange welcome awaited. King Edward III, the architect of France's misery, sat on his throne to receive his cousin. The relationship between these two men was a tangled web of blood and claims. Edward believed he was the rightful King of France. John was the man sitting in his chair. Yet when they met, there were no chains, no forced kneeling. Edward descended from the dais and embraced John. They kissed on both cheeks. They exchanged pleasantries about the journey, the weather, and the health of mutual relatives. It was a family reunion held at gunpoint. To an outsider, it would have looked like two old friends meeting for a drink, not the clash of nations. But the underlying tension was as tight as a bowstring. Edward was not just greeting a cousin. He was greeting his retirement fund, his leverage, his victory. John was greeting the man who held his life in his hands, The politeness was a thin veneer over a transaction that involved millions of gold coins. After the formalities, John was not thrown into the Tower of London. That grim fortress was for traitors and criminals, not anointed kings. Instead, he was escorted to the Savoy Palace. Situated on the banks of the Thames, between the City of London and Westminster, the Savoy was the most luxurious residence in England. It belonged to the Duke of Lancaster and was a marvel of white stone, terraced gardens, and glass windows. This would be John's prison. As the heavy doors closed behind him, shutting out the roar of the London crowds, the silence must have rushed back in. He was surrounded by opulence, silken sheets, roaring fireplaces, French wine. But he was utterly alone in a foreign land. The white ship had delivered him not to a dungeon, but to a five-star hotel with no checkout counter. He walked to the window and looked out at the Thames, a river that flowed into the same sea that touched France, yet felt entirely different. The adrenaline of the arrival faded, replaced by the dull, aching realization of the long haul ahead. He was safe, he was comfortable, and he was absolute property. The good fellow had survived the journey, but the king was now merely a guest in a house he could not leave, waiting for a bill he could not pay. The Savoy Palace was not built for sorrow. It was a masterpiece of 14th century architecture, a place where the stone floors were warmed by rushes and the high vaulted ceilings trapped the laughter of the nobility. For King John, it became a stage where he performed the strangest role of his life, the happy captive. To the casual observer, his imprisonment looked indistinguishable from a holiday. He was not shackled in irons, he was shackled in velvet. The English crown, understanding that a depressed king dies young and pays nothing, went to extraordinary lengths to ensure their investment remained in peak condition. John was given the run of the palace and its expansive gardens that sloped down to the Thames. He was allowed to receive visitors, and receive them he did. A steady stream of London's elite came to gawk, to flatter, and to marvel at the French monarch who held court in their midst. It was a social season that never ended, a cocktail party that lasted for years. Daily life at the Savoy was a regimen of aggressive leisure. John did not sit in a cell, counting hash marks on the wall. Instead, he counted courses at dinner. The sheer volume of consumption recorded in the household accounts is staggering. The king and his retinue, which included his son Philip, who had been captured with him, dined on roasted meats, spiced wines, and confectionaries made of sugar and almond paste. He employed a personal staff that rivaled that of the English king himself, chaplains to save his soul, barbers to trim his beard, and a man with the magnificent title of King of the Minstrels to ensure the entertainment was never subpar. He even kept pets. Historical records show he purchased dogs, falcons, and even a few exotic birds to keep him company. There is a dark humor in the image of a caged man keeping caged birds, perhaps whispering to them that he too was waiting for the door to open. But beneath the surface of this hedonism lay a cold, hard reality. The English were not giving this away for free. Every pheasant, every barrel of Bordeaux, every yard of silk for a new robe was meticulously recorded by English clerks. John was living on a tab. The hospitality of the Savoy was, in effect, a high-interest loan. The English knew that by allowing John to live like a king, they were increasing the moral pressure on France to pay. If they had thrown him in a dungeon, he would have become a martyr, and his people might have refused to pay for a broken man. But by keeping him visible, regal, and expensive, they maintained his value. He was a luxury item that France had to buy back. The good fellow played his part enthusiastically, ordering new clothes with a frequency that suggested he was trying to single-handedly revive the textile industry. He commissioned astrologers to cast horoscopes, seeking favorable alignments in the stars since he couldn't find them on the battlefield. One of the most fascinating aspects of his captivity was his freedom of movement within England. He wasn't always locked in the Savoy. He was taken on hunting trips to Windsor and other royal parks. Imagine the scene: the King of France galloping through an English forest, chasing an English stag, flanked by English guards who were also his drinking buddies. It blurs the line between prisoner and guest until the distinction feels almost invisible. Yet the line was there. It was in the eyes of the guards, who never looked away. It was in the polite but firm refusals whenever he asked to send messages without them being read. It was in the silence that fell when the subject of the ransom was raised. John was a bird on a very long, very golden tether. He could fly, but only in circles. Historians have often criticized John for his behavior during these years. They argue that while his kingdom was starving, he was ordering embroidered tunics. They paint him as a frivolous man who enjoyed the lack of responsibility. And perhaps there is truth to that. Being a king is hard work. Being a royal prisoner is, by comparison, a life of leisure. But there is another interpretation. In the medieval code of honor, appearance was reality. To look poor was to be poor. To look defeated was to be defeated. By maintaining his splendor, John was maintaining the dignity of the French crown. He was refusing to let the English see him crumble. It was a performance of defiance, albeit one that cost a fortune. He was saying, "I am still the king, even here, even now." As the months turned into years, the novelty of the Savoy began to wear thin. The gardens, once a refuge, became a boundary. The river, once a view, became a barrier. The endless feasts began to taste of ash. John watched the seasons change through the leaded glass, the green of spring turning to the gold of autumn, then the grey of winter, over and over again. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys of London, a city that was busy, alive and free. He heard the distant sounds of commerce, of ships unloading at the docks, of life moving forward while he stood still. The luxury became a suffocating blanket. He was trapped in a loop of comfort, a prisoner of his own status. And all the while, the bill was growing. The clerks in the back rooms tallied the expenses, adding them to the mountain of gold that France would eventually have to find. The good fellow was racking up a debt that would take the sweat of 1,000,000 peasants to pay off. The gilded cage was beautiful, yes, but the bars were made of solid arithmetic, and they were closing in. While King John was busy sampling the finest vintages of the Thames Valley, his son, the Dauphin Charles, was tasting something far more bitter: the acrid flavor of total political collapse. If the Savoy Palace was a gilded cage, the Palais de la Cité in Paris was a crumbling fortress besieged by its own citizens. Charles was 18 years old, a young man with a physique that seemed to mirror the broken state of his kingdom. He was pale, prone to illness, and possessed a right hand that would often swell and pain him, a stark contrast to his father's robust, mace-swinging vitality. Historians often pause here to marvel at the genetic lottery. In a time that worshipped warrior kings, France was left with a sickly intellectual. Yet, as the winter of 1357 deepened, it became clear that Charles's frailty was a mask for a spine made of cold-tempered steel. He would need it, because the inheritance his father had left him consisted entirely of debts and enemies. The immediate crisis was not the English army, but the French coin. The treasury was empty. To pay the soldiers who were supposed to defend the realm, Charles was forced into a humiliating economic sleight of hand. Debasement. The royal mints began to mix copper and base metals into the silver coinage. The new coins were turning dark, earning them the derisive nickname monnaie noire, black money. It was a desperate measure that acted like a poison in the veins of the economy. Prices soared. A loaf of bread that cost a denier yesterday cost two today. Merchants bit into coins to test their worth and spat them out in disgust. The people of Paris, watching their savings evaporate, did not blame the abstract forces of economics. They blamed the boy sitting in the palace. They whispered that the Dauphin was not just weak, but a thief, stealing the silver right out of their pouches. Charles found himself trapped in a relentless cycle of confrontation with the Estates General. This assembly, led by the fierce provost of the merchants, Etienne Marcel, had transformed from an advisory body into a revolutionary tribunal. They met in the Great Hall, a cavernous space that amplified their shouts, demanding powers that no French monarch had ever surrendered. They wanted to fire the king's advisors. They wanted to control the tax collection. They wanted, essentially, to rule. Charles, sitting on the dais, looked out at the sea of angry faces, men in fur-trimmed robes who controlled the city's wealth, and felt the terrifying precariousness of his position. He had no army to disperse them. He could not arrest them without sparking a riot. He had to sit there, a silent statue of royalty, absorbing their abuse while his mind raced, looking for a crack in their unity. The stress of these months is hard to overstate. Imagine being a teenager, your father a prisoner, your country occupied, and your own capital city slowly turning against you. Charles was isolated. His relatives, particularly his brother-in-law, Charles of Navarre, known to history as Charles the Bad, were plotting against him, whispering to the mob that the Dauphin was incompetent. Charles the Bad was a charismatic, treacherous figure who saw the chaos as a ladder. He would stand on platforms in the Parisian parks, delivering fiery speeches that whipped the crowds into a frenzy, while the Dauphin watched from his high windows, a prisoner in his own home. It was a psychological siege. Every day, Charles had to wake up and perform the role of regent, issuing orders that might be ignored, signing decrees that might be mocked, all while maintaining the serene mask of Valois authority. Yet it was in this crucible that the wise king began to emerge. Charles realized that he could not outfight these men, so he would have to outweight them. He began to practice a form of political judo. When the estates demanded the dismissal of his advisors, he agreed, then quietly kept them close. When they demanded reforms, he nodded, then delayed the implementation. He used his physical frailty as a shield, pleading illness to buy time, to cancel meetings, to let the anger of the mob cool. He was learning that power is not always about the sword. Sometimes it is about the silence. He saw that the merchant faction, for all their noise, was not united. The rich merchants feared the poor laborers as much as they hated the crown. Charles began to gently pull at these threads of division, waiting for the fabric of the revolt to tear. But before the recovery could begin, the darkness had to deepen. The winter was hard, and the streets of Paris were filled with the desperate and the hungry. The Monnaie Noire had failed to solve the crisis. The soldiers were still unpaid, and they had begun to turn into brigands, raiding the countryside around the capital. The smoke of burning villages could sometimes be seen from the towers of Notre Dame. The Dauphin was running out of maneuvers. He had sold the crown jewels. He had melted down the silverware. There was nothing left to sell but his dignity. In a moment of supreme humiliation, he was forced to stand before the estates and listen as Etienne Marcel lectured him like a schoolboy, dictating the terms of the Great Ordinance, a document that effectively stripped the monarchy of its absolute power. Charles signed it. He had no choice. But as the ink dried, one can imagine his pale eyes hardening. He was bending, yes, but he was memorizing every face, every insult, and every betrayal. The good fellow in London was drinking wine and playing at chivalry, but the boy in Paris was learning the cold, sharp lesson of survival. He was discovering that a king without gold is just a man in a fancy hat, and that if he ever wanted to wear the crown for real, he would have to buy it back, not from the English, but from his own people. If you walked the streets of Paris in the early months of 1358, you would have noticed a change in the palette of the city. The usual drab browns of peasant wool and the mismatched motley of the poor were being replaced by a striking uniform splash of color. Men were wearing hoods, chaperons, divided vertically into two bright halves, one red, one blue. These were the colors of Paris, but they had become the uniform of a dangerous new idea. They signaled allegiance not to the king, nor to the church, but to the commune. To wear the hood was to say that the city belonged to itself. At the center of this chromatic revolution stood Etienne Marcel, the provost of the merchants. He was a man of sharp features and sharper intellect, a wealthy cloth merchant who had looked at the ruin of the French monarchy and decided that if the nobility could not save France, the shopkeepers would. The tension that had been simmering in the Great Hall finally boiled over on a freezing morning, February 22nd, 1358. This date marks one of the most dramatic violations of royal sanctity in French history. A scene so vivid, it feels scripted for a stage play. Marcel gathered a mob of 3,000 armed tradesmen. They were not a disorderly rabble. They were a militia, disciplined, angry, and wearing the red and blue hoods like a badge of war. They marched to the Palais de la Cité. The guards, outnumbered and likely sympathetic to the complaints about unpaid wages, stepped aside. The mob flowed into the palace like a rising river, surging up the stone stairs, filling the corridors with the heavy tramp of boots and the clatter of weapons. They didn't stop at the audience chamber. They pushed all the way to the Dauphin's private bedroom. Imagine the scene inside that room. Charles, the 18-year-old regent, was surrounded by a handful of his most loyal advisors, including the Marshal of Champagne, Jean de Conflans, and the Marshal of Normandy, Robert de Clermont. The air in the room would have been thick with the sudden, terrified realization that the sacred barrier between subject and sovereign had evaporated. When Marcel entered, he did not kneel. He stood before the Dauphin, backed by men with drawn swords, and issued a demand. The army must be reorganized, and the traitors advising the prince must be removed. Before Charles could answer, The violence erupted. It was fast and brutal. The mob fell upon the two marshals. Right there, in the private sanctuary of the future king, amidst the bed linens and the tapestries, the two nobles were hacked to death. The violence was so close to the Dauphin that the blood of his protectors splattered onto his robes. Charles stood frozen, a terrifying silence falling over the room as the metal ceased ringing. He expected to die. He looked at Marcel, waiting for the blow. But the provost had a different script in mind. In a gesture that historians still debate, was it mockery, protection, or a supreme act of political theater? Marcel stepped forward and took the red and blue hood from his own head. He placed it on the Dauphin. In exchange, he took the Dauphin's own fine hat and placed it on himself. It was a visual inversion of the world. The merchant crowned with royalty, the prince branded with rebellion. Marcel turned to the crowd and declared that the Dauphin was now under the protection of the people of Paris. Charles was alive, but he was no longer a ruler. He was a mascot, wearing the colors of his captors. For the next few weeks, Paris existed in a strange state of revolutionary euphoria. The red and blue hood was everywhere. The bodies of the murdered marshals were dragged to the marble courtyard of the palace and left on display, a grim warning to anyone who still believed in the old order. The Dauphin was a prisoner in his own home, forced to sign edicts drafted by Marcel, forced to smile at the men who had killed his friends. It is difficult to imagine the psychological toll this took on the young man. He was living in the center of a city that had just shown him it could kill him whenever it pleased. Every meal might be poisoned, every guard might be an assassin. Yet, it was here that Charles's genius for survival truly crystallized. He played the part of the broken puppet perfectly. He wore the hood. He nodded at Marcel's lectures. He gave every indication that he had accepted his new reality as a figurehead for a merchant republic. But beneath the submissive veneer, Charles was plotting. He knew that Paris was not France. The countryside, the old nobility, the provincial towns, they looked at the chaos in the capital with horror. Marcel had overplayed his hand. By killing the marshals, he had alienated the warrior class. Charles just needed to get out. His opportunity came in March. He convinced Marcel that he needed to leave the city to attend a meeting of nobles in Senlis, arguing that only he could persuade them to accept the new reforms. It was a risky gamble. If Marcel had been more ruthless, he would have kept his prize under lock and key. But perhaps Marcel, drunk on his own success, believed he had truly broken the boy's spirit. He let him go. The moment Charles passed through the city gates, likely the Saint-Denis gate, and heard the heavy portcullis grind shut behind him, the dynamic of the war changed instantly. The wise king shed the red and blue hood and breathed the cold, clean air of the open road. He did not go to Senlis to preach reform. He went to Compiègne and then to Meaux, gathering loyal knights and appalled nobles to his banner. The mask dropped. He declared Marcel a traitor and the Parisians rebels. The letters he sent out were no longer polite. They were the furious decrees of a monarch scorned. He began to blockade the capital. The food shipments that fed the massive belly of Paris were cut off. The city that had taken the king hostage was now itself under siege. Back in London, King John must have received the news with a mixture of horror and helplessness. His capital was in revolt, his son was a refugee in his own kingdom, and the ransom negotiations were now practically meaningless. Who could pay 3 million écus when the treasurer was a revolutionary merchant and the king's collector was on the run? The irony was bitter. The English had captured the king to get gold, but by shattering the French state, they had made it impossible to collect the debt. You cannot garnish the wages of a ghost. And as the spring of 1358 warmed the fields of France, a new and even more terrifying sound began to rise from the countryside, not the cheers of merchants, but the low guttural growl of a peasantry pushed beyond the brink of human endurance. The merchants had revolted in the city, but the fields were about to catch fire. If the revolt in Paris was a political chess match played with red and blue hoods, what happened next in the countryside was a wildfire that consumed the board entirely. To understand the horror of the Jacquerie, you must first understand the silence of the French peasant. For centuries, the feudal compact had been simple. The peasant worked the land to feed the knight, and in return, the knight raised his sword to protect the peasant. But since Poitiers, the sword had been broken. The knights had failed. They had not only lost the king, they had let the English burn the harvest, let the mercenaries steal the winter grain, and then, with the audacity of the desperate, demanded more taxes to pay for their own ransoms. The protectors had become predators. The peasant, known affectionately and condescendingly by the nobles as Jacques Bonhomme, Jack Goodfellow, was assumed to be a creature of infinite patience, a beast of burden who would groan but never bite. They were wrong. In late May 1358, the silence broke. It didn't start with a manifesto or a speech, but with a spark in the Oise Valley, north of Paris. A group of peasants in the village of Saint-Leu-de-Serran clashed with a company of men-at-arms. It should have been a routine act of bullying, soldiers taking food, peasants weeping in the dirt. But this time, the peasants fought back. They killed the knights. And in that moment of shocking taboo violence, a dam burst. The realization spread like a contagion. The armored men could bleed. The gods did not strike down those who raised a hand against their betters. The rage that had been accumulating in the gut of the countryside for generations exploded. The uprising swept through the north of France with the speed of a plague wind. This was not an army. It was a spasm of pure hatred. Men armed with scythes, pitchforks, and knives bound to poles, weapons of the harvest, turned into weapons of harvest mortis, poured across the fields. They didn't march, they swarmed. They descended upon the castles and manor houses that dotted the landscape. These stone islands, once symbols of safety, became traps for the nobility. The chronicles of the time, written almost exclusively by terrified monks and nobles, describe the Jacques as demons, as animals walking on two legs. They tell stories of unspeakable atrocities, of knights roasted on spits, of ladies violated and forced to eat the flesh of their husbands. Historians today debate the extent of these horrors. Were they truly that widespread, or were the chroniclers exaggerating to justify the brutal retribution that followed? The truth is likely a grim middle ground. The violence was undoubtedly savage, a venting of years of trauma where the peasant sought to erase the very existence of the class that had failed him. They burned the manors, not just to destroy the buildings, but to burn the manorial rolls, the parchment records of debts and serfdom. It was a war against memory, an attempt to burn the paper chains that bound them to the land. Amidst this chaos, a leader emerged who defies the mindless mob myth. Guillaume Carle was a wealthy peasant, a man of intelligence and charisma, who tried to impose order on the whirlwind. He saw that rage alone would not defeat professional soldiers. He organized the Jacques into companies, appointed captains, and even tried to coordinate with Etienne Marcel in Paris. It was a moment of terrifying potential. The merchant hammer in the city and the peasant anvil in the country closing to crush the nobility between them. Marcel, seeing an opportunity to distract the Dauphin, sent a token force to aid the peasants. For a brief, dizzying moment, it looked as if the entire social pyramid of France was about to be inverted. But the wolves of the fields had forgotten one thing. Wolves hunt in packs, but knights hunt in armies. The nobility, terrified by the smoke rising from their estates, forgot their own feuds. The English and French knights, who had been killing each other months before, now looked at the peasants and saw a common enemy. To them, this was not war. It was pestilence. You do not negotiate with the plague. You burn it out. The counterattack was led not by the Dauphin, but by his treacherous brother-in-law, Charles the Bad, King of Navarre. Charles was a man who played politics with a poisoned dagger, and he dealt with the Jacquerie with ruthless efficiency. The end came at the Battle of Mello on June 10th. Guillaume Carle, trusting in the codes of war, accepted an invitation to parley with Charles the Bad. He walked into the nobles' camp expecting a negotiation. Instead, he was seized. The rules of chivalry, Charles explained with a sneer, applied only to knights, not to peasants. Cole was tortured and beheaded. Some accounts say he was crowned with a red-hot iron trivet, a mocking coronation for the king of the Jacques. With their leader gone, the peasant army, which was really just a gathering of angry, frightened families, collapsed. What followed was not a battle, but a hunt. The knights, armored and mounted, rode down the fleeing peasantry in the fields where they had once grown wheat. The slaughter was industrial. Villages were torched, entire communities wiped off the map. Men, women, and children were cut down without mercy as the nobility sought to re-establish the order of the world through the sheer weight of corpses. The suppression of the Jacquerie was so violent that it broke the spirit of the French peasantry for centuries. The good fellows were taught a lesson written in blood. The sword always wins against the scythe. By late summer, the smoke had cleared, but the landscape was changed. The fields lay fallow, choking on weeds. The cattle wandered untended. The silence had returned, but it was the silence of a graveyard. For the Dauphin Charles, the crushing of the Jacquerie was a double-edged sword. The immediate threat to the social order was gone, but his kingdom was a charred ruin. How do you pay a king's ransom when the people who grow the crops are dead? How do you tax a village that is nothing but ash? And in London, the news of the Jacquerie must have felt like a confirmation of English superiority. To the court at the Savoy, France looked like a madhouse, a place where the head, the king, was cut off, and the body, the people, was tearing itself apart. King John, hearing of the destruction of his lands and the slaughter of his subjects, could only pray and wait. The wolves had been driven back into the dark, but they had left deep claw marks on the soul of the nation. The golden age of chivalry had died in the mud of Poitiers. Now, the simple dignity of the common man lay dead in the fields of the Oise. France was not just bled dry of money, it was being bled dry of hope. And the bill, the impossible, staggering bill for the king's return still sat on the table, gathering interest in the dark, while the smoke of the Jacquerie still drifted over the scarred fields of the Oise. A different kind of violence was being committed in the quiet, panelled rooms of London. This was a war not of scythes and swords, but of quills, wax, and parchment. It was a conflict of geometry, where the stroke of a pen could slice entire provinces from a kingdom and condemn generations to foreign rule. King John, still living the surreal life of a pampered captive at the Savoy and Windsor, found himself sitting across the table from the English negotiators. The dynamic had shifted. In 1357, the English had seen France as a wounded animal. By 1359, after the collapse of the peasant revolt and the chaos in Paris, they saw it as a carcass ready to be butchered. King Edward III looked at the reports of French anarchy and decided that the price of a king had just gone up. The initial negotiations had produced what historians call the First Treaty of London in 1358. It was harsh, demanding 4 million écus and the restoration of Aquitaine, but it was, in a grim sense, traditional. But as France continued to bleed, Edward tore up that draft. Why settle for a slice of the cake when the baker is dead? He presented a new document, the Second Treaty of London, in March 1359. The terms were breathtaking in their greed. They did not just demand a ransom, they demanded the dismantling of France as a major power. The treaty stipulated that the English king would receive full sovereignty over Western France, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and the vast duchy of Aquitaine. It was effectively half the kingdom. In addition, the ransom for John's person was set at a crushing 4 million écus. Imagine the scene where John was presented with this document. The room would have been silent, save for the rustle of the parchment and the crackle of the fire. The English diplomats likely watched him with the cool detachment of predators. John, the good fellow, the man who believed in the chivalric bond, read the terms that would turn his descendants into minor princes of a truncated state. And then he did something that stunned his contemporaries and baffles historians to this day. He signed it. He dipped his quill into the ink and affixed his royal seal to the death warrant of his own realm. Why? This is the question that haunts the biography of King John II. Was it simple desperation? Had the years of gilded captivity broken his spirit so completely that he would trade anything for the smell of French air? Or was it a distorted sense of honor, the belief that a captive must agree to his captor's terms, no matter the cost? Some scholars argue for a more cynical interpretation. John knew the treaty was so outrageous that his son and the council in Paris would never accept it. By signing, he could play the good prisoner to Edward, shifting the blame for the rejection onto the Dauphin. He could say, "I tried, cousin, but my unruly subjects refused to obey." It would be a masterstroke of passive-aggressive diplomacy, buying time with a check he knew would bounce. The treaty was rolled up, sealed with red wax, and dispatched across the Channel. It traveled not with an army, but with a small retinue of messengers, carrying the weight of the world in a leather tube. When it arrived in Paris, the city was just beginning to breathe again. Etienne Marcel was dead, assassinated in July 1358 by loyalists who had tired of his intrigue. The Dauphin Charles, now firmly in control, unfolded the document in the Palais de la Cité. As he read the clauses, his pale face must have hardened. The sheer scale of the concession was insulting. It was not a peace treaty. It was a surrender of national identity. To accept this was to admit that the Valois dynasty was finished. Charles did not act alone. He summoned the Estates General, not the revolutionary mob of Marcel, but a more sober assembly of nobles and clergy who had survived the purges. He read the treaty to them. The reaction was immediate and unified. For the first time in years, the fractured political classes of France spoke with one voice. They declared the treaty neither passable nor doable. In a famous retort that echoed through the courts of Europe, they stated that they would rather endure the great distress of continued war than share the kingdom so completely. It was a moment of profound maturity for the French state. They were choosing the suffering of war over the shame of dismemberment. They were rejecting their own king's signature to save the king's realm. The rejection was sent back to London. When Edward III received the news, his reaction was volcanic. He had been so sure of his leverage. He held the king. He held the winning hand. But the Dauphin had called his bluff. Edward realized that the good fellow in the Savoy was useless if the government in Paris refused to honor his pledges. The diplomatic mask slipped. If France would not dismantle itself with a pen, Edward would do it with a sword. He declared that he would invade again. Not a raid, not a skirmish, but a conquest. He would march to Reims, the sacred city where French kings were crowned, and he would take the crown for himself. The preparations for the campaign of 1359 were immense. It was to be the largest English army ever to leave the island. The docks of Sandwich and Dover groaned under the weight of supplies. This was not just an army of soldiers. It was a moving city. Edward brought everything he needed to live in France permanently. Portable ovens, hand mills for grinding corn, packs of hunting dogs, and even, in a detail that underscores his confidence, a small boat made of boiled leather so he could go fishing in French rivers during the siege. He was packing for a relocation, not a battle. For King John, the rejection of the treaty and the preparation for war was a personal catastrophe. He was moved from the comfort of the Savoy to the starker confinement of Somerton Castle in Lincolnshire, far from the social whirl of London. The message was clear. The party was over. He was no longer the honored guest. He was the failed bargaining chip. As he sat in the damp northern castle, listening to the wind howl across the fens, he must have felt the crushing isolation of a man who has failed everyone. He had failed his people by losing the battle, failed his captor by failing to deliver the peace, and failed his son by signing a treaty that forced the boy to disobey him. Meanwhile, in France, the Dauphin Charles prepared for the storm. He knew he could not defeat Edward in the field. The French army was still a broken thing, terrified of the English longbow. So he chose a strategy that was radical, unchivalrous, and brilliant. He ordered a scorched earth policy. The peasants were told to bring their grain and livestock inside the fortified towns. The fields were to be left empty. The bridges were to be broken. He would not fight the English. He would starve them. He would let the winter and the mud do the work that his knights could not. As the massive English fleet appeared on the horizon in October 1359, the stage was set for a different kind of war. A war of endurance, where the victor would not be the man with the sharpest sword, but the man with the fullest granary. The first drafts had been written in ink and rejected. The final draft would be written in hunger. The English invasion of 1359 began not with a battle cry, but with the heavy rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the wet soil of Calais. It was late October, a time when sensible generals were packing away their tents and retreating to winter quarters. But Edward III was not feeling sensible. He was feeling cheated. He had brought an army designed to end a nation. It was a force of over 12,000 men, a number that sounds modest to modern ears, but was, in the logistics of the 14th century, a moving metropolis. The baggage train alone stretched for miles, a serpentine procession of wagons groaning under the weight of tents, mills, forges, and the personal luxuries of a nobility that refused to campaign without its comforts. They brought falcons to hunt French birds and greyhounds to chase French hares. They brought the leather boats to fish in French rivers. They stepped off the ships with the swagger of landlords coming to evict a troublesome tenant. But as the army turned south, marching into the heart of Picardy and Artois, they walked into a ghost story. The landscape was eerily silent. The villages were not just abandoned, they were stripped. There was no grain in the silos, no cattle in the pastures, no hay in the barns. The Dauphin Charles, coordinating the defense from Paris, had enforced his scorched earth decree with a discipline that bordered on the miraculous. He had ordered the rural population to retreat into the fortified towns and castles, taking everything edible with them. The English knights, eager for the clash of lances and the ransom of prisoners, found themselves fighting a war against emptiness. They rode through a grey, desolate world where the only enemy was the relentless, driving rain that turned the roads into rivers of glue. This phase of the war reveals the terrifying maturity of the Dauphin's strategy. It requires immense political will to tell a knight not to fight. The French nobility, raised on the red meat of chivalric romance, were itching to charge out of their gates and sweep the invaders away. To sit behind stone walls while foreign soldiers trampled their fields was a humiliation that burned worse than fire. Yet Charles held them back. He understood what his father never did, that an army is a beast that must be fed. If you starve the beast, its claws become useless. He bet the survival of his kingdom on the simple biological fact that an Englishman cannot eat glory. The target of Edward's march was Reims. This was not a random choice. Reims was the holy site of French coronation, the place where the Sainte Ampoule, the vial of holy oil sent from heaven, was kept. Edward intended to take the city, have himself crowned King of France in the cathedral, and present the world with a fait accompli. He arrived in early December, just as the winter truly set its teeth into the land. He surrounded the city, setting up a blockade that he hoped would force a surrender. But Reims was ready. The archbishop and the citizens had reinforced the walls and stocked the granaries. They looked down from the parapets at the shivering English host and simply locked the gates. For 5 weeks, Edward waited. The siege of Reims was a miserable affair. There were no grand assaults, no scaling ladders, no boiling oil. It was a contest of comfort. Inside the city, the French were warm and fed. Outside, the English were living in sodden tents, their magnificent horses dying of cold and hunger. The foraging parties returned empty-handed or ambushed by local levies. The price of a loaf of bread in the English camp rose to astronomical heights. The King of France, as Edward styled himself, was unable to enter his own coronation city. He was a monarch knocking on a locked door, and no one was answering. On January 11th, 1360, acknowledging the futility of the situation, Edward lifted the siege. He turned his back on the cathedral and marched his army away, a coronationless king leading a hungry mob. The campaign then devolved into a destructive wandering. Edward moved east into Burgundy, seeking food. The Duke of Burgundy, playing a clever double game, met Edward not with an army, but with a bribe. He paid the English 200,000 moutons d'or, a massive sum, essentially a corkage fee, to just go away and not burn his vineyards. Edward took the gold and moved on, but gold cannot be eaten. The English army was now bleeding morale. The knights were bored. The archers were sick. The magnificent baggage train was shedding wagons in the mud. They were winning every skirmish, burning every undefended farmhouse, but they were no closer to conquering France than when they started. In March, Edward made his final gamble. He turned toward Paris. If he couldn't be crowned in Reims, he would take the capital. The English army appeared outside the walls of Paris in late March 1360. They set up camp in the suburbs, burning the villages of Châtillon and Montrouge. Edward drew up his battle lines in full view of the Louvre. He sent heralds to the gates, challenging the Dauphin to come out and fight like a man. It was the ultimate provocation. From the towers of the city, the Parisians could see the smoke. They could hear the English trumpets. The pressure on Charles to sally out must have been excruciating. His people were watching their homes burn. His knights were gripping their sword hilts. But Charles V stood on the ramparts and did nothing. He watched the English army arrayed in their rusted armor, their banners whipping in the wind, and he kept the gates shut. He knew that Edward was bluffing. The English had no siege engines capable of breaching the massive walls of Paris. They had no food to sustain a long siege. They were posturing. Charles simply waited. It was a victory of silence. After a few days of shouting at stone walls, Edward realized the game was up. He could not provoke the boy. He could not feed his men. Furious and humiliated, he broke camp and marched away towards the Loire, intending to regroup in the fertile lands of Brittany. It was a retreat disguised as a maneuver, but it was a retreat nonetheless. The great winter raid, which had begun with such terrifying promise, had dissolved into a muddy, hungry slog. The English army was intact, yes, and they had looted plenty of silver, but they had failed to break the French will. They were a virus that the host body had successfully quarantined. As they trudged south of Paris, heading toward the cathedral city of Chartres, the mood in the ranks was foul. They were tired of the rain. They were tired of the French refusing to play by the rules of chivalry. And little did they know, the sky above them was turning a bruised, angry purple. The human war had failed to decide the fate of kings, so the heavens were about to intervene. The good fellow, King John, sitting in his cell back in England, could not save his kingdom. The Dauphin, sitting in Paris, could not defeat the English army. It would be left to the wind and the hail to broker the peace that men could not find. The retreat from Paris was a sullen affair. It was April 1360, and the English army was moving south across the vast, flat plain of the Beauce. This region is known as the breadbasket of France, a landscape of endless horizons where the sky feels immense and pressing. But in the spring of 1360, there was no wheat in the fields, only the trampled mud of 1,000 hooves. The soldiers were exhausted. They had marched across a kingdom, knocked on the doors of Reims and Paris, and had nothing to show for it but rusted mail and stolen silverware. The mood in the camp was brittle. Edward III rode near the front, his face likely a mask of frustration. He was the greatest warrior of his age, yet he had been defeated by closed gates and empty barns. He was looking for a battle, a place to vent the violence that had been frustrated all winter. What he found instead was something that would terrify him more than any French charge. It was Easter Monday, the 13th of April, a day that would go down in English history as Black Monday. The morning began innocuously enough, perhaps a bit grey, but by afternoon, the temperature plunged with a violence that made the air gasp. The sky turned a color that has no name in the lexicon of weather, a bruised, strangled purple that swallowed the light. There was no thunder at first, just a sudden, suffocating silence, the kind that animals understand before men do. The horses began to rear and scream, and then the heavens opened. This was not rain. It was not even a normal hailstorm. The chroniclers describe hailstones the size of goose eggs, jagged blocks of ice, falling from the clouds with the velocity of sling stones. The assault was instantaneous and lethal. There was no cover on the open plain. The baggage wagons were smashed, the canvas tents shredded like tissue paper. Men were knocked from their saddles, their skulls fractured by the bombardment. The horses, terrified and battered, stampeded, trampling the fallen. It is said that the storm killed more English soldiers in a single hour than the French had managed to kill in the entire campaign. Estimates suggest that 1,000 men and nearly 6,000 horses perished in the onslaught. Imagine the sound, the deafening roar of ice hitting armor, a cacophony of metallic clatter and human screams, all played out under a sky that seemed to be collapsing. Lightning forked down, striking the earth with apocalyptic fury, illuminating the carnage in strobe light flashes of blue and white. For the medieval mind, this was not meteorology, it was theology. To Edward III, shivering under the shelter of a wagon, or perhaps huddled in his armor while the ice hammered against his plate, the message was terrifyingly clear. He was fighting a war against a divinely anointed king, John, and he was ravaging a Christian land during the holy season of Lent and Easter. God was not just watching, God was shooting back. The storm was a judgment. It was a divine decree that the war must end. The English army, so confident in its martial superiority, lay cowering in the mud, beaten by the weather. In the midst of this icy hell, Edward did something that changed the course of history. He looked toward the horizon, where the spires of the Cathedral of Chartres were visible, grey fingers pointing accusingly at the storm clouds. Chartres was the sanctuary of the Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven. Edward dismounted. He fell to his knees in the slush and mud, facing the cathedral. There, amidst the dying groans of his men and the roar of the thunder, he made a vow. He promised the Virgin that if the storm ceased, he would accept peace. He would abandon his claim to the French throne. He would stop the burning. It was a moment of profound psychological break. The warrior king, who had spent decades trying to seize the crown of France, was finally humbled by a force he could not intimidate. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a landscape that looked as if it had been beaten with hammers. The fields were white with ice, dotted with the dark shapes of the dead. But the political landscape had been scrubbed clean. The intransigence that had blocked the negotiations for years evaporated. Edward was no longer the conquering hero. He was a penitent. He gave the order to halt the march and open communications with the French. The Dauphin, Charles, safe in Paris, must have listened to the reports of the storm with a quiet wonder. He had not defeated the English, but the sky had. The scorched earth had starved them, and the Black Monday had broken them. Negotiators from both sides rushed to the village of Bretigny, near Chartres, to hammer out the details. The atmosphere was no longer one of dictation, but of urgent compromise. The English wanted to go home before God threw another lightning bolt. The French wanted the English out before there was nothing left of the kingdom to save. The treaty that emerged, the Treaty of Bretigny, was finalized in May 1360. It was a document born of exhaustion and terror. The terms were still harsh, but they were no longer fatal. Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, the very thing he had started the war for. In exchange, he was given full sovereignty over a massive enlarged Aquitaine, amounting to nearly a third of France, plus Calais and Poitiers. He would hold these lands not as a vassal of the French king, but as an independent monarch. And of course, there was the matter of the ransom. The figure was set at 3 million écus, specifically 3 million gold crowns, écus d'or. This was a staggering sum, equivalent to several years of the French crown's total income. To guarantee the payment, France would have to provide hostages, 40 noblemen and princes of the blood, including King John's two younger sons, Louis of Anjou and John of Berry. When the news reached King John in England, the relief must have been overwhelming, mixed with a bitter aftertaste. He was going home. The cage was opening. But the price was the mutilation of his kingdom. He was trading land for liberty, gold for breath. The good fellow had survived, but he was returning to a France that was smaller, poorer, and deeply traumatized. As the scribes at Bretigny sanded the ink on the parchment, they were sealing a deal that would pause the 100 Years' War, but not end it. They were buying a generation of peace with a mountain of gold. The Treaty of Bretigny is often cited by historians as the moment where the medieval concept of a kingdom shifted. France was no longer just a collection of feudal estates. It was a national entity that could be carved up, priced, and sold. The ransom of King John was not just a personal debt. It was a national mortgage. And as the English army packed up its battered wagons and began the long march to the coast, leaving the ice-scarred fields of Beauce behind, the people of France began to realize that the end of the war was just the beginning of the payment. The storm at Chartres had stopped the killing, but it had started the counting. And the counting would be merciless. The hamlet of Bretigny, a smudge of thatch and stone on the vast canvas of the Chartres plain, was an unlikely place to redraw the map of Europe. It was a place of mud and turnips, usually smelling of sheep. But in May 1360, it smelled of hot wax and nervous sweat. Here, in a hastily erected pavilion that flapped in the spring breeze, the architects of peace gathered to dismantle a war. The Treaty of Bretigny was not merely a ceasefire. It was a deed of sale for a kingdom. The atmosphere inside the tent was a suffocating mix of legal pedantry and suppressed rage. The English negotiators, still shaken by the divine artillery of the hailstorm, were eager to secure their gains in writing. The French, representing the Dauphin, were like men undergoing surgery without anesthesia, trying to save the patient's life by agreeing to amputate his limbs. The document that emerged from these sessions was a masterpiece of medieval bureaucracy, a dense thicket of clauses that sought to quantify exactly how much humiliation France could endure. The headline figure was the ransom, 3 million gold écus. To the modern ear, 3 million is just a number, a statistic. To the medieval mind, it was a fantasy. It was a sum so large it ceased to be money and became a geological feature, a mountain of gold that had to be moved by hand. It was equivalent to 2.5 times the annual revenue of the French crown in a good year, and France had not had a good year in decades. To pay it, every pocket in the realm, from the velvet purse of the duke to the rough wool pouch of the ploughman, would have to be turned inside out. But the gold was only half the price. The territorial concessions were even more painful. Edward III was to receive a great Aquitaine, a swollen, massive version of his ancestral lands. Poitou, Périgord, Limousin, Quercy, Rouergue, and a dozen other counties were stripped from the French crown and handed to the English king in full sovereignty. This was the crucial legal knife twist. Edward would no longer hold these lands as a vassal of the French king. He would be their absolute monarch. In exchange, Edward agreed to renounce his claim to the French throne. He would stop calling himself King of France and settle for being the King of England and the Lord of half of France. It was a trade of a title for a territory, a paper crown for real dirt. There is a fascinating historical nuance here, a scholarly debate that centers on the renunciation clauses. The treaty stipulated that Edward would give up his claim to the throne only when the territory was fully transferred, and John would give up his sovereignty over the lands only when the renunciation was made. It was a diplomatic chicken and egg scenario. In the final drafting at Calais months later, these specific renunciations were moved to a separate document to be signed later. They never were. Some historians argue this was a calculated trap by the French, a deliberate legal loophole left open by the clever Dauphin Charles, allowing him to legally restart the war years later because the conditions had not been met. Others say it was simple negligence, the result of tired men wanting to go home. Either way, the Peace of Bretigny was built on a foundation of missing paperwork. The human cost of the treaty was formalized in October 1360, when the two kings met at Calais to ratify the agreement. Calais was an English enclave, a fortress city of grey stone and a grey sea. King John was brought over from England, no longer a prisoner, but not quite free. He was the currency in the transaction. The reunion of the monarchs was, by all accounts, a lavish affair. There were banquets where the wine flowed, and the meats were spiced with cinnamon and cloves, masking the bitter taste of the occasion. Edward and John dined together, two middle-aged men bound by blood and war, acting out the pageant of chivalry one last time. They swore oaths on the Eucharist to keep the peace forever. They exchanged gifts. It was a theater of friendship performed over the corpse of a mutilated France. But the true tragedy of Calais was happening at the docks. For King John to go free, someone else had to take his place. The English were not naive. They knew that a released king might conveniently forget a debt of 3 million écus. They demanded collateral. The hostages of Bretigny were a collection of the highest blood in France, dukes, counts, and princes. Among them were John's own sons, Louis, the Duke of Anjou, and John, the Duke of Berry, along with his brother, the Duke of Orléans. Imagine the scene on the windswept quay. The King of France, dressed in his traveling furs, embracing his sons. He was trading his freedom for theirs. He was boarding the ship to France while they were being led to the English ships that would take them to the Tower of London or the Savoy. It was a father buying his life with his children's liberty. The chroniclers praised John's stoicism. But one must wonder at the silence that hung between the father and the sons as the exchange was made. Was there resentment? Was there a silent plea? Or was it simply the brutal acceptance of their station, that they were not men, but assets of the crown? As the English ships faded into the mist, carrying the princes of the lilies into captivity, King John turned his face towards the French interior. He was free. On October 25th, 1360, he stepped off the boat at Boulogne. He walked onto the sand of his own kingdom for the first time in 4 years. He walked not as a conqueror, but as a debtor. The crowds that gathered to see him did not cheer with the wild abandon of victory. They watched with the wary hope of people who knew the bill was coming due. The king was back, but the country he returned to was a shadow of the one he had left. The fields were burned, the castles were broken, and the map had been redrawn with a heavy English ink. John's journey to Paris was a slow procession through a ruined landscape. He saw the scars of the Jacquerie, the blackened stones of the abbeys, the empty villages. The reality of the ransom began to settle in. He had promised 3 million crowns. He had promised to hand over the keys to cities that had fought and bled for him. The people of La Rochelle, when told they were now English subjects, famously wept and declared, "We will submit with our lips, but never with our hearts." This was the burden John carried as he rode toward his capital. He was the good fellow who had signed away the birthright of his subjects to save his own skin. The Treaty of Bretigny was signed, sealed, and delivered. The war was officially over. The English archers were packing their bows. The great invasion fleet was dispersing. But in the silence that followed the peace, a new sound began to rise, the scratching of the tax collector's pen. The fighting had stopped, but the bleeding was about to enter a new, more bureaucratic phase. France had to find the money. The gold had to be mined from the veins of a starving nation. The king was home, and now the king had to pay. And as the winter of 1360 approached, the people of France checked their empty larders and wondered if the peace might prove more deadly than the war. The invoice had arrived. The return of a king is usually a time for wine, bells, and bonfires. But when John II rode back into Paris in December 1360, the celebration had the hollow ring of a counterfeit coin. He was free, yes, but he was not the same man who had ridden out to Poitiers 4 years earlier. He was older, heavier, and he carried an invisible burden that weighed more than his plate armor. The first installment of the ransom. The sum required immediately was 600,000 écus. The treasury, which had been swept clean by the war, echoed with emptiness. To fill it, the king had to turn against his own people with a rapacity that rivaled the English invaders. The peace of Bretigny had stopped the bleeding of soldiers, but it had started the bleeding of the coin. To raise this mountain of gold, John authorized the creation of a new currency, one of the most famous and ironic numismatic artifacts in history, the franc. The name itself was a deliberate bitter pun, franc meaning free, signifying the king's liberation. The coin, known as the franc à cheval, depicted John on horseback, sword raised, charging into battle. It was a beautiful lie stamped in gold. It showed a warrior king in his glory, but every single one of those coins was minted to pay for his defeat. The people of France were forced to use a currency that celebrated the freedom of their monarch while enslaving them to his debt. To get these coins, the crown levied a sales tax on everything: salt, wine, bread, and cloth. The gabelle, the salt tax, became a hoarded symbol of royal extortion. Tax collectors, protected by armed guards, moved through the market squares, weighing sacks and checking ledgers. The joy of peace evaporated as the realization hit. The English had gone home, but they had left their bill behind. But taxes were not enough. The desperation of the crown led to moral compromises that shocked the nobility. In a move that scandalized the courts of Europe, John agreed to marry his daughter Isabella to Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the son of the Lord of Milan. The Visconti were incredibly wealthy, but they were seen as upstarts, tyrants, and barely noble by the standards of the French blood royal. To sell a princess of France to an Italian despot was a humiliation, a trading of ancient dignity for quick cash. But the price was right. The Visconti paid 600,000 écus for the privilege of mixing their blood with the Valois. It was a transaction that revealed the true depth of France's bankruptcy. The king was not just taxing his subjects, he was selling his family. Even this was not enough. In a final, cynical grasp for revenue, John issued a decree recalling the Jews to France. They had been expelled years earlier, their property seized. Now, they were invited back, not out of tolerance, but out of greed. They were granted residence rights for 20 years, but the entrance fee was steep, and every transaction they made would be taxed. They were treated like sponges, brought in to soak up money so the king could squeeze them dry. It was a cold, calculated exploitation that treated human beings as mere fiscal instruments. While the king scrambled for gold in Paris, the countryside was facing a new and terrifying threat. The Treaty of Bretigny had officially ended the war, which meant that thousands of mercenaries, English, Gascon, German, and Welsh, were suddenly unemployed. These men knew no trade but war. They had no homes to return to, so they didn't leave. They formed themselves into massive roving bands known as the Great Companies, or the Tarred Venus, the latecomers. They were like a cancer that had metastasized. They seized castles in the Rhone Valley and Burgundy, holding entire towns for ransom. The peace treaty had removed the English army, but it had left behind thousands of wolves. The peasantry, already taxed to the bone to pay for the king, now had to pay protection money to these brigands to keep their houses from being burned. The tragedy of this period is palpable. Imagine the French peasant in 1361. He is told the war is over. He is told to rejoice. Yet he pays a tax for the king's freedom. He pays a toll to the local brigand, and he watches as the coin in his hand, the beautiful gold franc, flows out of the kingdom in great, heavily guarded convoys towards Calais. The roads were clogged with carts carrying the wealth of France to England. It is said that the influx of French gold was so massive that it caused inflation in London. The English were drinking wine bought with French sweat, and still, it wasn't enough. The payments lagged. The economy, battered by the Black Death and the war, could not generate the surplus needed. John, sitting in the Louvre, received angry letters from Edward III. The hostages in London, John's own flesh and blood, were being moved to stricter confinement as the installments arrived late. The pressure on the king was immense. He was a man of honor, caught in a trap of arithmetic. He had sworn to pay, but the gold simply did not exist. He was the free king on the coin, but in reality, he was a prisoner of his own promise, watching his kingdom being eaten alive by tax collectors and mercenaries, knowing that every delay stained his honor and endangered his sons. The good fellow was beginning to realize that the price of his liberty might be higher than the price of his life. King John II was back in his palace, but he was not truly home. The France he had returned to in late 1360 was a landscape of surreal devastation, a place where the maps still bore the names of villages that had long since been reduced to ash and silence. The good fellow had imagined that his physical presence would act as a balm to the kingdom, that the sight of the monarch on his throne would restore order to a world turned upside down. He was wrong. The mystique of royalty had been shattered at Poitiers, and no amount of velvet or gold braid could hide the fact that the king was a man who had lost. He rode through a country that felt like a graveyard. The winter of 1360-1361 was bitter, and as the snow melted, it revealed a land infested not by English soldiers, but by something far more chaotic, the great companies. These were the routiers, mercenaries who had been laid off by the Treaty of Bretigny. In a healthy kingdom, a demobilized soldier returns to his plow. In a broken kingdom, he keeps his sword and finds a new master, hunger. These bands, with colorful and terrifying names like the Latecomers and the Great Company, roamed the provinces with impunity. They did not want to conquer France. They wanted to eat it. They seized castles, not for strategic value, but as bases for extortion. They were a cancer in the bloodstream of the state. John, eager to prove that he was still a warrior king, gathered an army to crush them. It was a chance to wash away the stain of Poitiers. But history, cruel and repetitive, had other plans. At the Battle of Poitiers in April 1362, the royal army was not just defeated, it was humiliated by these brigands. The king's knights were cut down by men who had no coats of arms, only scars. The defeat was a crushing psychological blow. It proved that the king could not even police his own roads. And then, the sky turned dark again. In 1361, the Black Death returned. It was known as the Peste des Enfants, the children's plague, because it targeted the young who had no immunity from the first wave, as well as the nobility who had largely escaped the first culling. It swept through the court like a scythe. It took the queen, Jeanne d'Arc of Auvergne. It took the flourishing crop of young heirs. The court was draped in black crape, a grim mirror to the blackened coins in the treasury. John found himself wandering the halls of a palace that echoed with the prayers for the dead. The good fellow was becoming a lonely ghost in his own life. Scholars often point to this period as the moment when John's mind began to drift away from reality. Faced with a kingdom he could not fix, an army he could not lead, and a debt he could not pay, he retreated into fantasy. He began to obsess over the idea of a crusade. It was the ultimate medieval escapism. If he could not save France, he would save the Holy Land. He spoke of leading a great host to the east, of washing away his sins in the Jordan River. To his counselors, struggling to find money to pay the ransom installments, this must have sounded like madness. The king was dreaming of Jerusalem, while the wolves were eating the peasants in Burgundy. It was a tragic disconnect. A man trying to be a hero in an epic poem while living in a gritty economic tragedy. Yet amidst the gloom, there was one stroke of dynastic luck. In 1361, the young Duke of Burgundy died of the plague without an heir. John, through his mother, was the closest relative. In a move of swift political opportunism, he rode to Dijon and claimed the rich duchy for the crown. For a moment, it seemed like the tide had turned. Burgundy was wealthy, fertile, and untouched by the worst of the war. But instead of keeping it as a royal domain to fund the treasury, John gave it to his youngest son, Philip the Bold, the boy who had stood by him at Poitiers. It was a gesture of fatherly love, rewarding the son who had not abandoned him. But politically, it was a disaster. It created a powerful rival dynasty that would trouble the French kings for centuries. Even in his victories, John was sowing the seeds of future chaos. As 1363 approached, the atmosphere in the Louvre was suffocating. The ransom payments were falling behind. The English were sending curt, threatening letters. The hostages in London were writing home, begging for relief. John felt the walls closing in. He was the king of a ruined land, a widower, a defeated general, and a debtor. The freedom he had bought with such a high price tasted like ash. He was physically in Paris, but his honor was still held hostage across the Channel. He began to look at the sea again, not with fear, but with a strange, longing nostalgia. In England, he had been a celebrated guest, free from the crushing weight of governance. In France, he was a failure. The King Returns had been the title of the chapter, but the text was writing itself towards a different ending. He was beginning to realize that perhaps he belonged to his captors more than he belonged to his people. To understand the full tragedy of the Treaty of Bretigny, we must look away from the king in Paris and turn our gaze back across the grey, churning waters of the Channel to the men who were left behind. History often focuses on the monarch, the singular figurehead. But the ransom of John II was paid not just in gold, but in the stolen time of 40 human beings. These were the hostages of the lilies, a collection of the finest blood in France, shipped to England as living collateral. Among them were the king's own flesh, his second son Louis, the Duke of Anjou, his third son John, the Duke of Berry, and his brother Philip, the Duke of Orléans. Imagine for a moment the psychological weight of their position. They were not prisoners of war taken in the heat of battle, with the adrenaline of combat still singing in their veins. They were line items in a contract. They were human guarantees delivered to the docks of Calais and handed over like chests of specie. They were young men. Louis was only 21, in the prime of their lives, full of ambition and fire, now told to sit in a foreign land and wait until their father could bankrupt their own inheritance to buy them back. The life of these hostages in London was a strange, twilight existence. They were not thrown into dungeons. That would have been a diplomatic catastrophe. But neither were they truly free. They were housed in comfort, moving between the Tower of London, in its more residential quarters, and various royal estates. They were allowed to hunt, to dance, and to attend the court of Edward III. To the casual observer, they were honored guests, adding a splash of French sophistication to the English capital. But the gilded cage is still a cage, and the bars were made of their father's debts. Every time a ransom installment arrived late, which was often, the atmosphere at court would chill. The English king's smiles would tighten. Their privileges would be curtailed. They lived with the constant, gnawing anxiety that if the money stopped, they would be the ones to pay the price. There is a fascinating, often overlooked tension here between the generations. King John, the good fellow, had a somewhat romanticized view of captivity. He had enjoyed his time in England, bonding with his cousin Edward. But his sons were different. They were the new generation, harder and more cynical. Louis of Anjou, in particular, was a man of immense pride and impatience. He chafed under the restrictions. He looked at the English court, not with the eyes of a guest, but with the eyes of a rival. He saw his youth slipping away in a fog of English rain and polite dinner parties, while his father was back in Paris, arguably mismanaging the kingdom and dreaming of crusades. Louis was stuck in London, reading the letters that said, essentially, "Not yet. Be patient. The money is coming." The situation worsened as the months dragged into years. The 1360s were a difficult time for England as well. The Black Death had returned, and the novelty of having French princes as house guests was wearing thin. The English Parliament was grumbling. Why were they feeding these Frenchmen when the ransom wasn't being paid? The Great Aquitaine was proving difficult to govern, and the peace felt fragile. Edward III, feeling the pressure, began to tighten the screws. The hostages were moved around, their movements restricted. They were no longer the celebrities of 1360. They were bad debts walking. It is here that we see the fracture in the code of chivalry. Chivalry dictates that a knight's word is his bond, and that a hostage must remain until the debt is cleared. It is a system built on honor, but honor is easy when the wait is short. It becomes torture when the wait is indefinite. Louis of Anjou began to feel that he had been abandoned. He saw his father giving away the Duchy of Burgundy to his younger brother Philip, the one son who wasn't a hostage, and the bitterness must have been corrosive. Why should he, Louis, rot in London while Philip got the richest prize in France? The family dynamic was poisoned by the ransom. The father was sacrificing the sons, and the sons were beginning to wonder if the father was worth it. In 1363, a glimmer of hope appeared. The hostages were transferred to Calais. This was technically English soil, but it was on the French side of the Channel. They could smell the air of their homeland. They were moved there to facilitate new negotiations, a desperate attempt to restructure the payments that France simply couldn't make. Louis of Anjou was allowed a certain degree of freedom in Calais. He was on parole, a prisoner of honor. He was allowed to ride out to visit the shrine of Notre Dame de Boulogne, provided he returned by sunset. It was a test of his chivalry. For months, he passed the test. He rode out, he looked at the fields of France, and he rode back to the grey walls of the English citadel. But the negotiations stalled. The English demanded more land, more gold. The French treasury was empty. The talks dragged on through the summer, hot and fly-bitten, with no end in sight. Louis looked at the horizon. He was 24 years old now. He had a young wife he barely knew. He had a duchy he couldn't govern, and he had a father who seemed incapable of closing the deal. The concept of honor began to look less like a sacred vow and more like a suicide pact. Historians still debate the moment the decision was made. Was it a sudden impulse, born of a summer evening's ride? Or was it a calculated political maneuver designed to force a crisis? One evening in July 1363, Louis of Anjou rode out of Calais. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange, the colors of a bruised king. He was accompanied by his guards, men who perhaps respected his rank more than their orders. He rode to the shrine at Boulogne, as he had done many times before. But this time, when the sun dipped below the horizon, He did not turn his horse back toward the English fortress. He turned south. He spurred his horse and rode into the night, away from his parole, away from his honor, and away from the dead. He defected. He chose freedom over chivalry. The news of the escape struck the diplomatic world like a thunderclap. A prince of the blood had broken his parole. It was a scandalous breach of the code that held the medieval world together. If a prince's word meant nothing, then treaties meant nothing. Edward III was furious, declaring Louis a man without honor, a felon and a traitor. But the reaction that mattered most was in Paris. King John was devastated. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the foundation of chivalric honor. He had fought when he should have fled at Poitiers. He had signed treaties that ruined him because he believed in the sanctity of the seal. And now, his own son had publicly shamed him. The escape of Louis was not just a diplomatic crisis. It was a personal heartbreak. It told John that his values were dying, that the new generation cared more for survival than for the beautiful, rigid rules of knighthood. The escape of the Duke of Anjou left the other hostages in a precarious position. The English clampdown was immediate and harsh, but more importantly, it left a void in the agreement. The collateral was gone. The debt was unsecured. The delicate architecture of the Treaty of Bretigny was collapsing. King John looked at the empty seat at the table of honor and realized that there was only one person in France whose value was high enough to replace the Duke of Anjou. There was only one man whose word was still currency in the Bank of England. The father looked at the mess his son had made, and he knew what he had to do. The good fellow, prepared to make his final and perhaps his only truly successful journey. He would not send gold. He would send himself. The hoofbeats that carried Louis, Duke of Anjou, away from Calais did not just traverse the muddy roads of Picardy. They trampled across the delicate, unwritten laws that held the medieval world together. It was July 1363. The summer air was thick and humid, buzzing with the insects of the marshlands. But the young duke rode with the cold clarity of a man who has decided to burn a bridge while standing on it. He did not stop at the shrine of Notre Dame de Boulogne to pray, as his parole required. He spurred his horse past the boundaries of the English enclave, riding hard for the safety of the castle of Guise. When he finally dismounted, breathless and sweating, he was no longer a hostage. He was a fugitive. And in the eyes of his father, he was something far worse. A thief who had stolen his own body from the Bank of Honor. The escape of the Duke of Anjou is one of those pivot points in history where personal character collision causes geopolitical earthquakes. Louis was not a coward. He was a pragmatist. He was a man of the new age, a prince who looked at the Treaty of Bretigny and saw not a sacred covenant, but a bad contract signed under duress. He argued, likely to himself as he rode, and certainly to his critics later, that the English had acted in bad faith. They had delayed the transfer of lands. They had added new demands. They had treated the princes of the lilies like common debtors. In his mind, the breach of contract had started in London, not in Calais. He was simply walking away from a deal that had already soured. It was a lawyer's defense, cool and rational, but when the news reached Paris, it hit King John like a physical blow. The good fellow was dining in the Louvre, perhaps enjoying a rare moment of respite, when the messenger arrived. One can imagine the silence that fell over the hall as the report was read. The king's face likely drained of a color. For John, this was not a legal dispute. It was a moral catastrophe. He had raised his sons on the romances of Lancelot and Roland, on the absolute conviction that a knight's word is the only thing that separates him from a brigand. By breaking his parole, Louis had not just embarrassed the crown. He had invalidated the moral authority of the Valois dynasty. If the king's son was a liar, then who could trust the king? The fallout was immediate and explosive. Edward III, upon hearing of the escape, flew into a rage that terrified his court. He accused the French of perfidy, of being a nation of oath-breakers. He threatened to halt all peace negotiations and, worse, to take reprisals against the remaining hostages. The other French princes still in English custody, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orleans, suddenly found their comfortable captivity turned into rigorous confinement. They were the collateral damage of their brother's impatience. The diplomatic channels, which had been humming with the slow work of peace, froze solid. Then came the confrontation. Louis of Anjou eventually made his way to Paris to explain himself. The meeting between father and son is a scene fit for a Shakespearean tragedy. On one side stood John II, the aging, battered idealist, the man who had chosen captivity over flight at Poitiers. On the other stood Louis, young, ambitious, and utterly unrepentant. Historians often debate the dynamics of this argument. Did Louis plead love for his young wife, whom he had not seen in years, as the reason for his flight? Or did he stand tall and tell his father that France could no longer afford the luxury of chivalry? There is a school of thought suggesting Louis represented the emerging realpolitik, the idea that the survival of the state is more important than the personal honor of the ruler. He might have said, "Father, I am of more use to you here, leading armies, than rotting in a tower in London." John would have none of it. To him, utility was nothing without honor. He looked at his son and saw a stranger. The rift between them was absolute. John banished Louis from his presence, a punishment that in the intimacy of the royal court was equivalent to social death. But the damage was done. The escape had created a vacuum. The English were demanding the return of the prisoner. Louis refused to go back. The deadlock was total. France could not force the Duke to return without sparking a civil war, and England would not negotiate until their asset was returned. In the midst of this family crisis, the reality of the kingdom's condition pressed in. The great companies were still ravaging the countryside. The plague was still lingering in the shadows. The ransom payments were hopelessly in arrears. The escape of Anjou was the final straw that broke the camel's back of John's patience. He saw his life's work, the peace, the treaty, the redemption of his kingdom, unraveling because of a lack of good faith. He felt a profound, crushing sense of responsibility. He was the king. The treaty was signed in his name. The debts were his debts. The sons were his sons. If the son would not pay the price of honor, the father would have to pay it for him. It was during this dark autumn of 1363 that John made the decision that has baffled and moved historians for centuries. He announced to his council that he would return to England. He would turn himself in. The council was horrified. They begged him to reconsider. "Sire," they argued, "you are the king. You cannot surrender yourself like a common criminal. The treaty is unfair. The English are cheating us." They pointed out the strategic madness of it. Why hand the enemy the head of state voluntarily? It was a suicide of sovereignty. But John was immovable. He famously replied with a line that should be carved in stone above the entrance to every chancellery in the world. If good faith and honor were to be banished from the rest of the world, they should still be found in the hearts of kings. It was a statement of magnificent, stubborn anachronism. John was a man of the 12th century, living in the 14th. He believed that the king was not just a manager of a country, but the moral compass of his people. If the compass spins wildly, the ship is lost. He had to go back, not because it was smart, not because it was strategic, but because it was right. As the winter winds began to strip the trees of Paris, the king began to pack his trunks. He was preparing to leave his capital, his freedom, and his life to clean up the mess his son had made. He was checking out of the Hotel of Liberty because he refused to skip out on the bill. The prince's escape had bought Louis of Anjou a life of power and politics. He would go on to become a major player in European history, but it bought his father a one-way ticket to a grave in London. The son had chosen the future. The father chose the past. And as John rode towards the coast in the dying light of 1363, he carried with him the heavy golden burden of a code that the world was rapidly forgetting. On a biting January morning in 1364, King John II stood on the docks of Boulogne for the final time. The wind off the channel was razor sharp, cutting through furs and wool, but the king did not shiver. He stood with the calm, terrifying resolve of a man who has already attended his own funeral. The ship that bobbed in the grey swell was waiting to take him back to England, not as a captive of war, but as a captive of his own conscience. The court he left behind in France was in a state of stunned disbelief. To his counselors, to his subjects, and even to the chroniclers scratching their heads in the monasteries, this was an act of madness. Why would a man who had escaped the lion's mouth voluntarily put his head back between its jaws? Why trade the crown of France for the cage of London? The answer lay in the invisible iron architecture of chivalry. John was returning to replace his son, the Duke of Anjou, who had fled. He was returning because the ransom was unpaid. He was returning because he believed that a king who did not keep his word was no king at all. As the gangplank was lowered, a hush fell over the harbor. It was not the cheers of a departure, nor the wailing of a defeat. It was the respectful, confused silence of people watching a martyr walk into the fire. John boarded the ship. The ropes were cast off. The distance between the king and his kingdom widened, a strip of churning grey water that would never be crossed again. When the ship docked at Dover, the reception was surreal. There were no chains, no guards with drawn swords. Instead, he was met with a fanfare of trumpets and the warm embrace of English nobles. To the English, John's return was a propaganda victory of incalculable value. It proved that their king, Edward III, was the righteous superior, the man to whom even the King of France submitted. But on a human level, there was genuine admiration. The English aristocracy, obsessed with the Arthurian ideals of honor, looked at John and saw the living embodiment of the code. He was the good fellow who played the game by the rules, even when the rules demanded his life. The journey to London was a winter pageant. John rode through the English countryside, the trees skeletal against the pale sky, and everywhere he went, he was feted. He arrived in the capital not as a prisoner, but as a celebrity. King Edward III rode out to meet him, and the reunion of the two monarchs was less a meeting of enemies than a gathering of old friends. They dined together, drank together, and swapped stories of the war. For a brief, shining moment, the Savoy Palace became the center of a strange, chivalric utopia, a place where kings could transcend politics and exist solely as brothers in arms. There were feasts of roasted swan and rivers of Gascon wine. There were hunt parties in the royal forests. It was the golden age of captivity restored, a sequel to the days of 1357, but with a darker undertone. Historians have long debated the hidden motivations behind this return. The romantic view is that of pure honor, the last knight sacrificing himself for his word. But there is a cynical, perhaps more human, counter-theory. Some scholars suggest that John was simply tired. He had spent 4 years in France, trying to govern a ruined country, fighting brigands, arguing with the states, and burying his family. He had faced failure after failure. In London, he was treated with deference. He had no responsibilities. The food was good, the beds were soft, and the bills were someone else's problem. Did John choose captivity because it was easier than kingship? Was this last honor actually a last escape? It is a question that lingers in the smoke of the Savoy's chimneys, unanswerable. However, the good fellow was not just there to eat and drink. He had returned with a purpose. He hoped that his presence would break the diplomatic deadlock, that he could negotiate a new treaty to replace the unworkable terms of Bretigny. He spent his days in talks with Edward's ministers, trying to craft a solution that would save his son's honor and his kingdom's future. But the wheels of diplomacy turned slowly, and the king's time was running out. The winter of 1364 was harsh, and the health of the French monarch began to fail. The robust energy that had carried him through the Battle of Poitiers was gone, replaced by a lethargy that no amount of spiced wine could cure. There is a profound sadness to these final months. John was surrounded by luxury, yet he was undeniably a tragic figure. He was a king without a kingdom, a father whose son had betrayed him, a man whose ultimate legacy was a debt he could not pay. He was the king of winter, ruling over a court of ghosts and memories. The English court, sensing the end, treated him with a gentle solicitude. They knew they were watching the last performance of a great actor. The pageantry continued, the musicians played, the jesters tumbled, but the audience was holding its breath. In late March, the king fell ill. It was a vague wasting sickness, perhaps a resurgence of an old malady, perhaps the sheer exhaustion of a life lived in the saddle and the cell. He took to his bed in the Savoy. The River Thames flowed past the window, indifferent and grey, carrying the ships that were sailing to the France he would not see again. The doctors came with their potions and their leeches, but the patient had no fight left. He had fought the English, he had fought the brigands, he had fought the plague, and he had fought his own pride. Now, he simply surrendered. On April 8, 1364, King John II died. He was 44 years old. He died not on a battlefield, surrounded by his knights, but in a foreign palace, surrounded by his captors. The news of his death sent a shockwave through Europe. Even his enemies wept. Edward III paid for a magnificent funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral, a final gesture of respect for the man who had been his greatest prize and his favorite guest. The good fellow had paid the final installment of his ransom with his life. He had returned to captivity to save his honor, and in doing so, he had become a legend, a cautionary tale of what happens when a king tries to live like a knight in a world that is becoming a business. His body was prepared for the long journey home. The king, who had crossed the channel 3 times, once as a captive, once as a free man, and once as a volunteer, would cross it a 4th time as a corpse. He was leaving England, but he was leaving behind a legacy that would haunt France for decades. The ransom was still unpaid. The territory was still lost. The great companies still roamed the land. But as the funeral cortege wound its way through the streets of London, silence fell over the city. For a brief moment, the war stopped. The arithmetic of debt was suspended. All that remained was the memory of a man who had kept his word, even when it cost him everything. The last honor had been paid. Now the debt passed to the son. The return of King John's body to France in May 1364 was a procession of silence. The wooden coffin, draped in the fleur-de-lis, rolled through the northern gates of Paris, past the same crowds that had cheered his coronation and wept at his capture. He was laid to rest in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of French kings, his stone effigy carved to look eternal and serene, a stark contrast to the chaotic, debt-ridden reality of his final years. But as the heavy doors of the crypt sealed the good fellow into the dark, a new light was breaking in the palace above. The crown passed to his son, Charles V. The boy who had fled the field at Poitiers, who had worn the merchant's hood in the face of a mob, and who had learned the art of silence in the shadow of defeat, was now the king. And with his ascension, the romantic, disastrous Middle Ages of King John died, and something colder, sharper, and infinitely more effective was born. Charles V, known to history as the Wise, looked at the mountain of debt his father had left behind. The ransom of 3 million écus was still largely unpaid. Only about a third had actually crossed the channel. The Treaty of Bretigny still hung over the kingdom like a sword. A good fellow would have continued to bleed the peasantry to honor his father's word. But Charles was not a good fellow. He was a lawyer on the throne. He looked at the ransom not as a sacred vow, but as a political tool. He realized a terrifying truth. The taxes established to pay the ransom, the gabelle on salt, the aids on goods, the fouage on hearths, had created a machinery of revenue that the French monarchy had never possessed before. For centuries, kings had to beg their nobles for money to fight wars. Now, because of the ransom, the king had a direct line to the pockets of his subjects. Charles made a decision that would shape the future of France. He kept the taxes, but he stopped paying the ransom. It was a quiet revolution. The gold that was meant to flow to London began to accumulate in the Louvre. Charles used it not to buy back his father's honor, but to buy a new kind of army. He hired professional captains, men like the ugly, brilliant Breton Bertrand de Guesclin, a warrior who fought not for chivalry, but to win. They did not seek the grand, open-field battles that John had loved. They fought a war of shadows. They ambushed English supply lines. They scaled castle walls at night. They bribed town governors. When the English armies marched out, looking for a fight, the French simply vanished into the woods, leaving the invaders to starve in the rain. It was the strategy of the scorched earth made permanent. The English, confused and frustrated, found their great victory evaporating. Edward III was old. The Black Prince was dying of dysentery in Bordeaux. The great Aquitaine they had won on paper began to crumble in reality. One by one, the towns and castles were retaken, not by the charge of the heavy cavalry, but by the patient, relentless pressure of a king who fought with a ledger in one hand and a bag of gold in the other. By the time Charles V died in 1380, nearly all the conquests of Poitiers and Brittany had been reclaimed. The ransom had effectively paid for the reconquest of the kingdom it was supposed to cripple. Historians often debate the morality of this golden scar. Charles V effectively founded the absolute monarchy on a lie. He used the pretext of a national emergency, the king's captivity, to establish a permanent system of taxation that would oppress the French peasantry for another 400 years, until the Revolution of 1789. The ransom was the excuse that never went away. The emergency tax became the ordinary tax. The French state was built on the back of John's failure. It is a bitter irony. The ineptitude of the father created the mechanism for the son's success. France was bled dry, yes, but the blood was transfused into the veins of a stronger, more centralized state. The legacy of King John II is thus a paradox of gold and iron. He is the king who lost everything, his army, his freedom, his life, yet his sacrifice acted as a strange kind of fertilizer. His captivity forced France to grow up. It destroyed the old feudal notion that a king could rule by charisma and sword strokes alone. It taught the cruel lesson that war is a matter of finance, and that honor is a luxury that a starving nation cannot afford. The good fellow lies in his tomb, a symbol of a beautiful, dying world of chivalry. Above him, the modern state rose, built by the wise son, who knew that it is better to be rich and unloved than poor and honorable. As we look back across the centuries, the tragedy of the ransom softens into the tapestry of history. The muddy fields of Poitiers are now quiet pastures. The Savoy Palace was burned down during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Its luxury turned to ash. The gold coins, the francs à cheval, sit behind glass in museums, silent witnesses to a deal that changed the world. The pain of the peasant, the anxiety of the hostage, the shame of the captive king, all of it has faded into the gentle hum of the past. The story of the ransom is no longer an invoice to be paid. It is a lesson to be learned. It tells us that even in the deepest defeat, there are the seeds of recovery. It tells us that while gold can buy a king, it cannot buy a kingdom's soul. And it reminds us that history is not just a list of battles, but a long, slow negotiation between what we owe to the past and what we must build for the future. The account is settled. The books are closed. The king sleeps. And France, the beautiful, scarred, resilient kingdom, endures. The ink is dry, and the last candle in the scribe's room has burned down to a pool of warm wax. The clamor of the 100 Years' War has faded into the silence of the night. The shouting of the merchants, the thunder of the charge, and the scratching of the quill have all ceased. We have walked together through the mud of Poitiers, sailed the grey waves of the Channel, and wandered the gilded halls of the Savoy. We have seen a kingdom broken and a kingdom remade. Now, let the heavy velvet curtain of history fall gently across the stage. There are no more debts to be paid tonight. The ransom is history, and history can no longer demand anything from you. Let your breathing slow, matching the quiet rhythm of a world at rest. The kings and princes have returned to the dust, leaving only their stories to whisper in the dark. You are safe in the present, far from the cold winds of the 14th century. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders, just as the armor slipped from the weary nights. The ledger is closed. The story is told. Peace has returned to the land, and now it returns to you. Sweet dreams.